starting this new series on Jonah, and as the promo said, if you feel like you're struggling to stay afloat in some ways, and maybe we have some overworked moms in the house this morning who feel that way, if you feel like life is unfair at times, if in your honest moments you struggle with anger over something in your past or something in your present right now, frustration, if in your honest moments again, you would realize and be willing to admit that, hey, I'm afraid of some things in my life. I feel fear in a certain area in my life. If that's you, you're not alone. You're not the first. And there's this story in the Bible that is often not taken seriously by thinking people because of some of the things in the story. I think it's one of the best pieces of literature ever written, actually, period. And it's certainly one of the best pieces of literature in the Bible. But there's this story about someone who faced all of these things to a dramatic degree, and sometimes it's funny, but underlying it's also very serious and can get down to the deepest parts of our life, and it's the story of Jonah. And Jonah is continually relevant in every generation. Again, this is a story a lot of people have passed off, and they don't take it seriously. But Jonah, you're going to see in the next few weeks, is one of the most shockingly relevant, perpetually relevant stories in the entire Bible. It always is. It's relevant to you and I personally. It's relevant to us as a society right now. In a presidential election year, that we'll just say it's less than inspiring, right? It's always relevant to us. On Women's Day at one church, why would you start a new series on Jonah? Well, one reason, Jonah is somebody who's called by God. He's a prophet, which means somebody who speaks for God, and he runs from God. That's part of his story. There are women who are called by God, and other people want them to run from God. About 50% of the churches in the United States, women are not permitted to give a sermon or permitted to serve on the church board. I don't know if you know that or not. A full half of churches in the United States in the 21st century. So there are a lot of women who don't want to run from God and their callings, but their church environments push them away from their calling. So hopefully this would be an encouragement to those ladies. One of our values at one church is that we don't place limits on our daughters. There are a lot of churches here in the Southeast Valley, and it's hard for me to believe, but there are people who will take their daughters to churches who won't let them do these things in the 21st century. And we believe here at one church that church is the last place where a little girl should have a glass ceiling placed on top of her in the 21st century United States. Do you agree with me on that? Do you agree with me on that? We want to be the kind of church where we can raise little girls to know that there don't have to be glass ceilings in your lives. And certainly not imposed on you by God based on a couple of scripture passages that are in the minority in the Bible, and there are lots of different interpretations of. So girls can pursue their calling here. But Jonah is only 4 chapters long, 48 verses total. That's all it is. It's like the Telltale Heart, Edgar Allan Poe. It's a short story length. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know when it was written. Sometime between 800 and 200 BC. We don't know exactly what it is. What kind of literature? Is it a short story? Is it a novella? Is it a parable? Is it midrash? Is it satire? We're not exactly sure. There are differences of opinion about that. It's funny at times, like satire. You can see a little Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert when you read Jonah. And at the same time, it reads perhaps like an extended parable, like Jesus told parables, which are stories that illustrate a spiritual point. And it's thought that maybe Jonah is kind of like an extended parable. It doesn't read like literal history. It reads more like kind of a mythological, fictitious story that illustrates a spiritual point. A lot of people get caught up with the historicity of Jonah, but I don't think we need to do that. But Jonah is ridiculously relevant to the 21st century United States. So here's a little bit about the plot of Jonah, and then we'll talk about why it's as relevant as it is. Jonah lives in what is now Israel. God calls Jonah to go to a city named Nineveh in the Middle East, and to take a message from God to Nineveh that Nineveh's wickedness, and again, this is ancient literature, Nineveh's wickedness has been seen by God, and God's going to destroy it if they don't turn from their wicked ways. And so Nineveh is this way, and Jonah goes this way. He doesn't want anything to do with what God has called him to do, And there's a reason for that. The reason is that Jonah doesn't like the people of Nineveh, and he believes that God will be merciful to them. And so it's not that he doesn't want to be the bearer of bad news. He would love for the bad news to happen to the people of Nineveh. But he knows that God's going to be merciful to these people if he goes, and so he runs in the opposite direction because Jonah doesn't want God to be merciful to the people of Nineveh. He boards a ship at what is now Yaffo, Tel Aviv, Yaffo in Israel, Jaffa, the port of Jaffa, and he heads out into the Mediterranean, probably towards Spain, the opposite direction. A storm blows up over the Mediterranean, and it's kind of a funny episode where it sounds serious, but the way it's written, it's funny. The merchant ship is in this storm, and they all think they're going to die, and so they decide to throw Jonah overboard, because the gods must be angry, and the gods are mad at this guy, and so they throw him overboard, and he's languishing, he's drowning in the sea. And then all of a sudden, and this is why a lot of people don't take the story seriously, but it's entertaining, how is Jonah saved from the Mediterranean? A big fish comes by and swallows Jonah, and he's in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And the fish swims back to the port city and vomits Jonah up where he left, spews him out, points him in the direction of Nineveh, and then his story to Nineveh continues, and we'll talk about that in coming weeks. So Jonah he's a prophet of God, but he's like the least spiritual person in the story. He's like a spiritual loser, basically, like the whiskey priest. Like he's the guy who's called by God to do things, but he's like the worst of the worst. And these sailors, and you know the reputation sailors are supposed to have, they're like, how bad are you, man? Why are the gods so mad at you? And so that's why they throw him overboard. And so one of the reasons, just to give you a heads up, one of the reasons Jonah is so relevant, Jonah hates the Ninevites because he sees them as enemies. They had taken over the northern kingdom of what is now Israel in 822 BC. They were the Assyrians, the Assyrian Empire. Jonah hates them. So these are people his people have been at war with. He views them as enemies. Do you know where the city of Nineveh is now? It really was an ancient city. Its ruins are located in northern Iraq. ISIS has actually taken over the area where Nineveh is located. It's next to Mosul, which is one of the cities in the worst violence in the Iraq War. It's really close to Tikrit, which is the birthplace of Saddam Hussein. And so this city is located in a place that we have been at war with. And of course, we want to stop violence, and we have to protect the United States, and there are all these political realities. But in just one way that it's relevant, it challenges us in our view of how do we view people we think are our enemies, right? So we have Jonah hating people in northern Iraq. That's just one way that it's relevant. It's relevant in a lot of personal ways as well. So this morning what we're going to do is we're going to read the whole first chapter of Jonah. When I was in Bible college, the religion professor, it was actually a preaching class. He's like, here's one thing you never want to do. You never want to read a long passage out of the Bible. He said, because it'll bore people. And so, unfortunately, sometimes that is true. But how many of you would like to prove him wrong today? Would that be okay? And just, isn't it fun to prove your professors wrong sometimes in college? So it's 17 verses. It goes by really quickly. It's super entertaining. But I figured it's only 4 chapters. It's a short story. It's a great story, one of the best. Let's just read the whole first chapter and get into it and enjoy how this story is told. So you guys ready? All right, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish, probably Spain. He went down to Joppa, this port, where he found a ship bound for that port in Tarshish. And paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God. And they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us, so that we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What is your country? And what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" Jonah, I love this, "Pick me up and throw me into the sea." He's like, "Whatever, man. Just, he doesn't even want to live. Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land. These are good people, good sailors. They don't want to kill him. But they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased." Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So this is Jonah's horrible, no good, very bad day, right? You see a guy who is supposed to be the hero of the story, and he's just the total anti-hero. And the sailors are like way better moral people than the prophet is. And he's despondent. He doesn't even care. They're all afraid they're going to die. He's asleep in the ship. He's totally depressed. And he's just throw me overboard. This is how upset he is that God has called him to show mercy to the people of Nineveh. So here's a map, just to give us a picture. This Joppa there is now Yaffo. It's where the city of Tel Aviv is. I've been there. It's really cool, beautiful. There's a big fountain that looks like a whale. It's dedicated to Jonah, and then there's a fountain that comes out of the whale's blowhole. It's just in Yaffo. So Nineveh is way up in northern Iraq, and Jonah sets sail for what is probably Spain in the opposite direction. Now, in the time we live in the United States, we live in a time in which religious fundamentalism is in its death throes. That there are people who are holding on to a particular interpretation of Christianity, that everything in the Bible is literally historically true. God created the world in 6 literal days 6,000 years ago. Now they're doing this, they're well-meaning people. They believe that if the Bible is not interpreted literally in all of those ways, then the whole thing is gone and it's all meaningless. So it's all or nothing, black or white. And so we live in a time in which there are people who would say, okay, if the Bible says Jonah was swallowed by a fish, then he was literally, historically swallowed by a fish. And then they would go on to try to explain how a guy could live in a fish's digestive juices for 3 days and not be consumed. And so there are people who have this view of the Bible. We honor that. We take it seriously. They're well-intentioned people. And at the same time, I would suggest that when we boil a story like this down to those literal details, we lose its power. And all of a sudden, the story becomes about a fish's digestive juices instead of what this amazing story can actually mean to us in every generation. So, for example, it doesn't mean that there was a literal tortoise and a literal hare. Are you with me? And like the tortoise was slow and steady and the hare was arrogant. The truth is that humbleness and persistence can win the race. And just like the parable of the prodigal son, it doesn't mean that there was one prodigal son and that was a historic, literal event. We're all prodigal sons. We're all Jonahs. We all run in some way. We all run out of fear and anger, and we all become despondent because of our view that is distorted of life. And so this story is meant to speak to us in profound ways far beyond whether a guy can live in a fish's belly or not. So the thought of God sparing the people of Nineveh is so disturbing to Jonah. Now, if we get past the funny parts, let's take it seriously. It's so disturbing to Jonah that if the people of Nineveh live, Jonah doesn't want to. If these people he regards as enemies live, he doesn't want to be on this earth anymore. If good things happen to them and they prosper and they do well, it offends his sense of justice and goodness and what he thinks is good to such an extent that he's depressed and despondent. Now, they were known to be violent. Jonah had a reason to have a grievance with the people of Nineveh. But God wanted to be merciful to them, and Jonah did not. And this is the result of that in his life. So I know a guy who got passed over for a job that he really wanted, and a woman was hired instead of him. And he was honest enough to say, hey, maybe they just had to fill a quota, right? And so he was honest enough to say he was envious, and he felt slighted. I mean, he was angry. He felt like he should have gotten the job, but somebody else was hired in his place. And instead of seeing that as a good thing, and maybe she was just more qualified, and maybe that was it. Maybe that's actually the answer, that a good thing happened. In his mind, a good thing didn't happen. And he was slighted in some way because of some kind of bias. You see how he can run from good. In his view of what happened there, he can run away from good. Well, maybe the more qualified person got the job, and that's the good thing. And it's tempting for him to run from that. You see what I mean? I had a conversation with a lady recently, a kind-hearted lady, who admitted when she sees her ex-husband on Facebook, like in pictures, like he's having fun in life, she has a really hard time with that. When he looks happy, she looks depressed. And so we can all run from good. Is it bad that he's happy? Is it good that he's happy? Well, it's good. But we can all run from the good. Jonah gets uncomfortably relevant sometimes, doesn't it? Because we can all have a distorted view of what good is. And we can run away from that because of envy or anger or fear. And so here's a question. Are you running from good? Are you running from something good in your life? Do you struggle with envy? Do you struggle with anger? Does it pain you to see somebody you don't like prosper? If they're happy, you're sad. And what's happening is your feelings are based on your view of that person. The ironic thing is, they're not making you sad. They're not making you envy. They're not making you bitter. They're not making you hold on to something. It really is your choice to do that. And somehow we can, in our thinking, we can feel like somehow we're hurting that person by not forgiving them, or we're hurting that person by being angry at them. But they're not even there to know. We're hurting ourselves thinking we're hurting them somehow. It's just this distorted thinking that we can fall into when we run away from good. So God thinks that showing mercy to the Ninevites would be good. But Jonah doesn't see it that way, and so he runs from good. Maybe you're single and you have a tendency to sabotage relationships. We live in a time where social media really has changed things. I graduated from high school in 1995, which is like ancient history, now. And so since then, social media has been created. We have a hookup culture, Tinder, swipe left, swipe right. How many of you even know what Tinder is? By a show of hands. Less than half of the people know what Tinder is. It's probably good, actually. We should celebrate that fact. Some people are like, should I know what Tinder is? Right? And so there's this culture of like, okay, it's cool to act like you don't want a relationship. It's cool to act like you don't want commitment. It's like the person who cares the least is in power. So always compete for caring the least about your relationship status. That's kind of how things work now in high school and college, which that's really super good for relationships, right? Pretending that you don't want one and that commitment is just a terrible thing that you would never want, and pretending like competing for who cares the least in a relationship. That really is the kind of environment that a lot of younger people have to struggle through now in relationships. So relationships get sabotaged before they even start. Are you afraid of commitment? Are you afraid of settling down? Are you afraid of entrapment? Are you afraid of being rejected? If so, that will cause you to run from good. There can be a good thing, a good relationship for you, a good person for you, but you run away from them because you're scared. You board the ship and sail in the opposite direction from what would actually be good in your life. Are you afraid of a change? Are you looking at a job change? Should you make a job change? Right? There are some of us who are like, man, I hate my job, right? And you would love to have another opportunity, but it's scary to do that. And so you go through the misery day after day, dragging yourself out of bed and making yourself do this because of fear. And you're running away from what could be 100 other opportunities by staying where you are. Because of that fear of change, you're running from the good. Are you running from good? When we first started One Church, totally true story here. For the first 6 months, I really felt like I was going to throw up every Saturday night. Totally true. I was so jittery and nervous and felt so unworthy, and I felt a sense of shame, who am I to give a sermon or to start a church or to be a pastor. I felt so bad about myself. For the first, I'm serious, 6 months, I didn't think it was ever going to end. And it took a while, it just kind of gradually faded away in the second half of that first year to where I didn't feel like that anymore. So doing what you're afraid of doesn't mean that the fear is going to instantly go away. What's the saying? Courage is not the absence of fear, but it's doing something in spite of the fear, right? You've heard that? And so it may be that the way you stop running from good is just to decide, you know what, I'm scared to death and I'm going to do it anyway. Because nothing ever gets accomplished if we let fear make us run from good. So is it a job change? Is it a career? Is it a relationship? Is it the next step in your marriage? Is it what is it? What is it that's tempting you to run from good? Now this gets deeper. And this is obviously a rhetorical. I'm going to ask you a question, and it's completely rhetorical and no show of hands. You'll see why in a second. Jonah is suicidal. Or again, if we get past an argument about a fish's digestive juices, and we just take the story for what it says, Jonah's suicidal. He falls asleep in the bottom of the boat when everybody else thinks they're going to die because he doesn't care, right? He's like the guy you don't want to rob that day. He's like, dude, you can point a gun at me. I really don't care. You picked the wrong guy to rob today. He's the guy who doesn't care if he lives or dies. When they cast lots and they find out it's him, which is kind of like rolling dice, and they find out it's him, he's like, yeah, I'm smooth, right? That didn't even happen the first 6 months of starting One Church. So imagine had that been the first 6 months, I would have fallen over right here. So Jonah's like, just throw me overboard. He didn't even care. He didn't care to live. So if we take it seriously, this is a guy who feels so violated, so offended by this group of people. If good things happen to them, he legitimately doesn't want to live anymore. If we take it seriously. He's so driven to despair and depressed. So here's the rhetorical question. Have you ever contemplated suicide? Now you ask, you realize why I didn't. And a serious question. If that's you, number one, if you feel that way right now, and I never take anything for granted. I had a friend who killed herself when she was 19. Complete waste. I never take anything for granted. I always assume that there are people in all kinds of different places in life. If that's you, oh my God, get help. Get help. Call me, call a counselor, email somebody. As the cliches go, it's a permanent solution to a temporary problem, right? And so I realize that at any given time, there may be people in all kinds of situations. And when you talk to people who struggle with depression, and maybe they have suicidal thoughts, and I'm sure you've heard this, they'll often say something like, man, it's like I'm swimming and the waves just pulled me out. Have you heard this? The waves pulled me out from the shore. It's like I got caught in the undertow, and I wasn't in control anymore because our thinking can get to that point. And running away from good, we can get to that point where we lose the ability to fight our way back. And depression is real. And you'll hear people talk about, I just felt like I was being swept out to sea. And in the story of Jonah, in Hebrew thought in general, the sea is a symbol of chaos. The fact that he even boards a ship and starts to head out to sea is like this ominous sign for a Hebrew reader. These were people who dwelled in deserts. The sea was something frightening and chaotic and scary to them. He's already getting himself into hot water by boarding the ship. His thinking is already leading him down a dark path. And then it just gets worse and worse. And now there's a storm. Now he's overboard, right? And so we can feel like we're being swept out to sea. If you're struggling with depression or suicidal thoughts, let me be a pastor who says to you, it's okay to take antidepressant medication. Some of you maybe grew up in a church environment like I did where they poo-poo medicine. And they'll almost like guilt somebody for feeling depressed, like you should make yourself feel better. If antidepressants help you, great. Go see a counselor. Take them. Everybody hear that? The pastor says, man, take antidepressants if they help you. Because there are pastors who won't say that for some reason. And if you see a good counselor, you can discover that all of us are susceptible to ways of thinking that do pull us out away from the shore, out into that chaotic sea as Jonah experienced. So let me ask you this. What are some thoughts that you have that lead to painful feelings? What thoughts lead to your painful feelings? Now, for some, this may not make sense. Like, well, I feel the way I feel. It's not for any particular reason. I feel that way because that's how I feel. That's how I should feel. I don't have any control over my feelings. Again, medication can help, but counseling can help too, because we do have control over our feelings. There could be a separation between your behavior and your feelings and your thoughts. This is the essence of cognitive behavioral therapy. And I'm not a therapist, so I'm not a professional. I know enough to be dangerous. But I do know there's a separation, and I've experienced this in my own life, that if you feel a certain way, if you feel miserable in a certain situation, you may or may not be suicidal, or you might be afraid of commitment. You might feel lonely. You might be struggling with things in your marriage, and you're not totally sure why. You might be paralyzed with fear in a job change situation, or a million other things, relationships with family, and maybe Mother's Day brings stuff up to you or for you that's painful, and you have these feelings. You're not your feelings. There can be a separation. It's so freeing to realize this. There can be a separation between you and your feelings, because your thoughts can determine your feelings, and your feelings can determine your behavior. And a good therapist could help work through this, but it might look something like this. I've shared about my experience going to see a counselor, which I absolutely affirm. I think it's a brave, wise thing to do. And one of the things I've learned is I'm an approval addict. And I want people to like me. I want people to think I'm successful. I want people to think I'm smart. And you're like, geez, man, you are not doing a very good job. If that is your goal, well, okay, fine, but that's what I want. Lie to me, delude me. That's what I want. It's really important to me that other people, some generic mass of other people in my mind, think I'm successful or smart or funny, and you're like, oh my gosh, dude, it's getting worse, right? Or whatever else, that they approve of me in some way. And if I don't think they approve of me, then I really do feel despair. I can feel despondent. I can feel worthless. I can feel like a failure. And it can be a pretty quick ride for me towards the Mediterranean, so to speak. And a good counselor helped me realize what's actually happening. That this isn't something that it's not out of control. I'm not really being pulled, swept out to sea. I really can do something about this. And he told this illustration with no connection to the series with Jonah, but it's perfect for the imagery. He's like, hey man, it's like there are a bunch of heavy barrels on the deck of a ship. And those barrels represent like your idea of other people's approval of you. It's not even their approval, it's your idea of their approval. And he's like, maybe there's one barrel that's super heavy and there's a rope tied around that barrel. And the other end of the rope is tied around your ankle. And in your mind, when somebody just comes along, not even attempting to hurt you or do anything, they don't even know you, and they pick up that barrel and they throw it over the side, there you go with it. Because you've chosen to tie yourself to this heavy barrel. They're not trying to throw you overboard. They're trying to throw the barrel overboard, but you go with it because you've tied yourself to it. So to break that down, because it gets complicated, it's not really the approval of other people. It's what I think. It's all in my head. It's what I think they think of me is like represented in that barrel. And so I'm creating a barrel that's super heavy because it's really important to me. And then I'm choosing to tie myself to that barrel, what I think they think of me. And it makes me really vulnerable because they can not even realize what they're doing and somehow offend my view of what they think of me. And then I feel bad. You see how this works? What a mess, right? But it's thoughts that can lead to feelings that can lead to behaviors. And I've discovered in my own life, if I'm miserable in some way, there are thoughts behind that. It's not like I'm not being swept out to sea. I'm not controlled by my feelings, but there are thoughts that lead to those feelings. And so let me ask you, in whatever area that you're miserable in, are you fearful, are you angry, are you envious, are you hurting? What thoughts are leading to that? Oh man, if you could do some exploration there in your own heart and find the thoughts behind those feelings, I mean, you're on your way to freedom. You're on your way, out of the stormy, chaotic sea. There's an exercise called the triple column that cognitive behavioral therapists would use, where you'd list your feelings. I feel lonely, okay? What thoughts lead you to that loneliness? Let's say it's somebody who's single. Well, all men are pigs. Well, that'll lead to loneliness. If you're, or you know how women are. All women just, well, that'll lead to loneliness. Or look at me. I'm not as attractive as, some other created, photoshopped thing. So, well, that thought will lead to loneliness. Or nobody understands me. Okay, well, that thought will lead, right? You follow me? That thought will lead to, there's a million of them that'll lead to that feeling. That feeling, you're not being swept out to sea by that feeling, but you're in control of that feeling by your thoughts. And maybe like me, you can figure out, I'm actually the one pushing myself out to sea. Kind of like Jonah. And when we do that, it just gets worse and worse and worse. So what painful thoughts lead to your feelings, and how could you change your thoughts to go back toward the shore and find healing? There's a mom, a wife, an author named Sarah Bessey, who is just one of these incredibly gifted writers and speakers who are a part of what we're a part of, this national growing movement of more open-minded thinking when it comes to following Jesus. And there's a network we're all a part of called the Open Network. And some of the guest speakers we've had are a part of that, and authors like Rachel Held Evans and Glennon Doyle Melton and Jen Hatmaker, and Sarah Bessey is one of them. And there's a 5-minute video I want to show you as we close where this speaker and author and wife and mom shares about some of the difficulties she's faced in life and how she sees childbirth as a metaphor for those difficulties and handling them. And so I challenge you as we think about thoughts that lead to painful feelings and are you running from good, to watch Sarah Bessey in this video called Lean Into It. There. What would it look like for you to lean into your pain? Are you running from good things because of fear, because of anger, because of envy? Are there thoughts that lead to painful feelings for you? What would it look like for you to uncover those thoughts and not be swept out to shore, but actually, like Jonah, end up back in the right direction? What would it look like to stop running from good things?